Everybody. Oh, there we go. Recording in progress. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Kim Anania. I am the owner of KMA HR Consulting. KMA has 37 talented employees, and we service businesses of all sizes and makeup in New England and beyond. We exceed at our providing fractional HR support in the disciplines of anything related to the life of an employee at work, recruiting, and compensation. I always say you're as good as the resources you have around you, and we aim to be a top-tier resource for our incredible HR community. That's why we're so excited to dive into one of today's most important and trending topics, neurodiversity in the workplace. We are honored to sponsor and host today's session, and even more thrilled to welcome our presenter and partner from MindThrive, Cassandra Jones. Before we begin, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes to share with you. The first is within the next 2 days, you'll receive a follow-up email from both KMA and Cassandra, which will include this SHRM code for certification credit, a copy of today's slides, a short 5-question survey to gather your feedback and ideas for future sessions, and a fantastic tip sheet for managers on how to better support neurodivergent employees. And all of this will be sent to the email you used to register for today's webinar. One more thing, with such a large group and a packed agenda today, we won't be able to open the floor for live Q&A, but don't worry, Cassandra will share her contact information and ways to continue the conversations at the end of the session. So let's get to the heart of it. Cassandra Jones is a powerhouse of knowledge, and what truly sets her apart is the lived experience she brings to this important work. Her insights are sharp, her stories are authentic, and her commitment to inclusion is inspiring. Our hope is simple, that you walk away with a stronger understanding of what neurodiversity means and at least one tangible takeaway to apply in your work ahead. So with that, Cassandra, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Kim. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. You've probably heard the term neurodiversity showing up more often in workplace conversations, but of course the meaning can feel unclear. What does it actually look like in the workplace? What should companies be doing differently? And why does this matter for every employee and not just a few? And that's what we're going to explore today. My goal is to offer insight and into how the workplace systems can sometimes create friction for neurodivergent employees, and how small intentional changes can lead to better clarity, performance, and also retention of your employees. This conversation is about how we adapt the environment, but it's also about how we structure the work, how we communicate our expectations, and how we create space for different ways of thinking and also for processing. And when we make those shifts, actually everyone benefits, but most especially the employees and your neurodivergent employees who've had to work harder just to keep up. And I come to this work, as Kim mentioned, not just as someone with a long HR career, but as someone with lived experience. So I am autistic and ADHD, what's sometimes referred to as ADHD, AUDHD, combination type, though I wasn't diagnosed until later in life. For years, I held high pressure leadership roles where I was seen and viewed as confident and effective, on the outside. But internally, I was definitely managing a lot of sensory, communication, social demands of the workplace in particular. And I was doing something called masking, and I was doing this without realizing it. But masking is where, in my personal situation, for me, it meant constantly pre-planning conversations, watching others for social cues, forcing eye contact, and constantly suppressing some of my natural behaviors in order just to meet workplace expectations. And it's the mental load of performing that version of yourself that fits into what's considered the norm or neurotypical, which we'll talk about. That effort took a toll for me personally, and it drained my energy. It made it hard to be fully present outside of work, and it left me wondering what are the things that look easy for people, for certain people, so hard for me, and why are the things that are hard for others easy for me? And once I got my diagnosis, that gave me a lot of clarity, and it also gave me a new perspective. And that experience is what led me to build MindThrive Coaching. And through my business, I coach neurodivergent adults, and I help them navigate work and life in a way that honors how their brain actually works. And I partner with organizations and companies to build systems that make that possible. And this work combines everything I care about. So again, I'm really thrilled to be able to present to you today. And that really entails helping individuals surface their strengths and support leaders as well to lead more inclusively, and create workspaces designed to meet people where they are, and where success doesn't come at the cost of an individual's authenticity or their well-being. So learning objectives. Here's what we're going to cover in our time together. First, we'll define neurodivergence and how it shows up at work in particular. And then we'll talk about common ways neurodivergent behavior is misread and how that affects performance. From there, we'll walk through the business case for designing systems with neurodiversity in mind. And we'll look honestly at the barriers many neurodivergent employees face. Even when their skills are strong, there are barriers that come into play. And finally, we'll close with some specific actionable changes that you can make across your employee lifecycle, from hiring to development, and retention. And along the way, I am going to offer a couple of short reflection prompts during the session, not more for not Q&A necessarily, but more to help you connect this to your real world experience. And when those come up, you can feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat. So let's jump in. All right, so let's start with the basics, which may be familiar to some of you that are already a bit more versed in the topic, but I just want to make sure we start at the same baseline. The term neurodivergent, this refers to people whose brains work differently than what's considered typical or neurotypical. And our brains are considered different in how we think, how we process, learn, focus, etc. And it's not a medical term, though many clinical diagnoses fall under that umbrella, of course. It's really more of a way to recognize natural variations in how human brains function. And being neurodivergent doesn't mean something is broken. It simply means a person's brain works differently from the majority. And that difference, of course, is a part of human diversity. And another term you may have heard recently that's gaining traction is cognitive diversity. So you can think of neurodivergence as cognitive diversity. And unlike race, age, gender, cognitive diversity often can be invisible from the outside. So understanding that helps us to start to notice where well-meaning systems might overlook or exclude people, not intentionally, of course, but simply because these systems weren't built or designed with different kinds of brains in mind. All right, I really like this slide. It shows just some of the identities that fall under the umbrella of neurodivergence. It's important for me to note this is not an exhaustive list. There are many, many other types of neurodivergence that aren't on the slide. I just wanted to give everybody a sense of some common ones. But it is, again, important to name that up front. What neurodivergence can include, again, looking at this slide, is autism, ADHD, which I've mentioned already, dyslexia, dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is one that's maybe lesser known. It has to do with small motor function. It's actually something I struggle with as well. OCD, Tourette syndrome, and more. These are often talked about as separate categories, and in reality, they tend to overlap, and that's something the visual does show you a bit as well. So individuals may identify with more than one of these, and that term is called co-occurrence. You may have co-occurring neurodivergent issues, and that's part of what makes each person's experience so unique. For example, someone might be autistic and ADHD like me, or they might experience a combination of dyslexia and anxiety. And these intersections really shape how a person learns, how they communicate, and how they navigate day-to-day expectations. You'll also notice the visual on this slide, the wheel that really helps to illustrate the range of experiences that fall under the neurodivergent umbrella. And it's not about drawing lines between categories, but really about expanding our awareness of what might be going on beneath the surface. Because again, often these things are very invisible. And because no two people experience these traits in exactly the same way. For instance, if you think about maybe ADHDers, if you know some ADHDers or have an ADHD loved one in your life, some ADHDers can display their traits very visibly. Maybe they're, constantly energetic or on the move, or they fidget a lot or something like that. But for me personally, as I've said, I have ADHD, but mine is much more invisible. My brain is always busy. It never shuts off. I have 100 ideas, thoughts running constantly. So it shows up very differently. In autism circles, there's a saying: if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that's because when we speak about autism being a spectrum, it truly is. And how it shows up for one person can look radically different for another. And that's why flexibility and curiosity matter so much in the workplace. As the next slide we start to think about, it focuses on common misconceptions that show up in the workplace today when it comes to neurodivergent employees. I'm not going to read all of them to you, but I will highlight a couple with some examples. These myths, or as I also will call them or label them, stigmas, often come from a lack of awareness or an overly narrow view of neurodivergent and what it actually looks like in the professional setting. As a result, neurodivergent talent is frequently underestimated, misunderstood, or miscategorized. So to talk about a few examples and that might challenge those assumptions, the first misconception I'll highlight is that neurodivergent individuals can't be leaders. And that could not be farther from the truth. Neurodivergent individuals can be excellent leaders. Many neurodivergent professionals bring exceptional insight, systems thinking, creativity to leadership roles. They often spot connections that others miss, or they approach problems from unique angles, and they stay calm under pressure. And the issue isn't about ability, it's whether the environment recognizes and values those traits when they might show up a little bit differently than the norm. The second misconception is that neurodivergence is a disorder. That's a common myth. That neurodivergence means something is someone is broken or disordered, and framing it that way can lead to those stigmas surfacing or missed opportunities, especially when those same traits can be tremendous assets in the right context. So many neurodivergent people, not all, though many, and many peers in my neurodivergent network, we would say that we wouldn't change our neurodivergent brain if we could. That's my personal view. I wouldn't change my brain if I could. Personally, I attribute many of my strengths and the successes that I've had to how I'm wired and what my neurodivergent brain brings to the table. Another common misconception is that it's just a Gen Z trend. I've been hearing that quite a bit recently with TikTok and things like that. And there's an assumption that neurodivergence is suddenly it's everywhere, and that it's something unique to Gen Z. What's actually changed, and this is my opinion, but kind of living this and really working to understand what's going on. What's really actually changed is awareness. Many people, especially women and adults who are diagnosed later in life, are finally being seen, understood, and neurodivergence is being named. And there's also a misconception that everyone needs the same support. So when we think about the workplace, there could be a tendency to assume that if someone's neurodivergent, they'll need the same accommodations as someone else with the same diagnosis. But needs do vary wildly, as I mentioned on the previous slide, even within one identity. And that's why flexible, individualized systems matter more than one size fits all solutions. And we'll talk more about that. But unfortunately, these misconceptions and others here on the slide that you can read on your own can unfortunately shape how neurodivergent employees are perceived, how they're included, and also whether or not they're given opportunities. And when we shift outdated assumptions and open the door to more accurate recognition of talent and more effective support systems and and really think about our workplace culture as a place where all thinkers can contribute fully. All right, so a quick little pause for a question from everyone. So, what percentage of the global population do you estimate is neurodivergent? And you can just drop your answers in the chat. Yeah. A 7%, B 10%, or C 20%. I see lots of C's, 10, C. Yeah, lots of C's. Great. Good. Okay. So I saw lots of C's and some other answers as well. And the answer is 20%. So 20% of the world's population is estimated to be some version of neurodivergent. And if you look that up and do your research, that comes from many, many, many studies. And I think it's still growing, it's still being understood, but I honestly expect that percentage to grow. I mean, I think of myself in particular and other women in my circle that I know that are late diagnosed and are finding this out later in life. It may be higher than we even know, but that's what the estimations are right now. So if you think about that in practicality, that's about 1 in 5 people. So when you consider your workplace, if 1 in 5 people are some version of neurodivergent, that means most likely they're already part of your workplace and your workforce, whether they've shared that identity or not, and honestly, whether they know it or not. So when we talk about neurodivergence, we're not talking about like a rare experience. We're talking about something that affects a significant proportion of the population. And yet, despite high levels of education and talent and all of that, an estimated 30 to 40% of neurodivergent individuals are unemployed or underemployed. And we'll talk about barriers later and why that might be happening. But just a couple of quick comments there to set the stage. Many may not be getting through your interview process. Maybe they have poor eye contact, as an example, which can be something we might have a bias toward, or hiring managers might have a bias toward. Or maybe they're not growing to their potential because their skills are not showing up in traditional expected ways. So they're perhaps missed for promotions and things like that. And I talked on the last slide about, is it a Gen Z trend? I do want to note the factor that the rates are rising with Gen Z, and about 53% of Gen Z who are either entering your workforce now or coming, 53% are diagnosed or self-identifying. Now, in my research and my understanding of this, again, not a trend, what's happening is that it's caught earlier. We know more, assessments are getting better. And then there's also the piece about girls, right? So girls, traits, they can show up differently than boys, and boys are have traditionally been assessed much more frequently than girls. But girls do show up differently, and we're learning more about that. And then women, like I said earlier, are being diagnosed later in life. And there were several decades where the medical community didn't know what they know now. So those rates are rising for a various, factors. And that's the point there. And in other words, the talent is there, but the systems haven't caught up. And while your neurodivergent workforce is already here, the stats say that 50% aren't even going to disclose that diagnosis at work. So that's something else we'll get into in my presentation. So I want to take it back to strengths and hone in on this a bit. There's a couple of areas in my presentation I could talk about and do a whole presentation on, and this is one of them. But just to give you a bit of a high level, view here. And it's something I think we don't talk about enough, and that's the strengths that come with neurodivergent profiles. Again, not an exhaustive list, but you'll see in the visual some common traits that are associated with different neurotypes. These aren't universal. Every person is different. These are patterns, right? These are patterns that we see often. And when you think about what that could bring to your workplace, think about creativity and innovation, systems thinking, pattern recognition, deep focus, especially deep focus if it's something that the individual is very much interested in or passionate about. Visual and spatial reasoning, high energy, passion, strong values, and a fairness lens. Across many neurotypes, there's often a very strong sense of justice and doing the right thing. And it's also important to note that these strengths may not always show up in the traditional sense, and they certainly may not be, on a resume, right? But in the right environment, they're powerful assets. And this is why a strengths-based lens matters, in particular with neurodivergent employees, because when we know what to look for, we start to see the talent that actually might already have been there and is getting overlooked. So with strengths come common misreads, and this also speaks perhaps to some stigmas. But when we talk about barriers, and I mentioned early that I was going to get to barriers, so here we are. One of the biggest barriers is just in general misinterpretation. So there are certain traits, especially when you view it through a neurotypical lens, which the norm, right, versus neurodivergence, can be misread or labeled incorrectly, or responded to in ways that create unnecessary friction. So some examples that I have on this slide, if we take a look at that, if you think about someone who's direct or very literal, they might be seen as aloof. They might be seen as blunt, when what they're really showing you is a straightforward communication style. Or a person that appears rigid may actually be driven by deep integrity and a strong, like a really strong internal logic, that sense of justice that guides their decisions. Sensory difference, sensitivity to light, to noise is very common in neurodivergent individuals, smells, etc. That might lead someone to appear overwhelmed or appear withdrawn when actually they're really just trying to self-regulate. Or intense focus, or a preference for consistency might be read as resistance or inflexibility, even though it comes from a place of kind of care and precision. Or for those who've spent years masking, which I mentioned that earlier in the presentation, that's trying to fit in or pass as neurotypical. That constant mental effort can lead to exhaustion, which might show up as a flat effect or disengagement at times. And to be clear, this doesn't mean, and I know we have a lot of HR people on the call, and having been in HR, for years and years myself, it doesn't mean we excuse poor behavior, right? This is separate from that. We don't want to overlook legitimate, performance issues. It's more about kind of lifting up and thinking about, is this person just showing up cognitively, different, and are we misreading what we're seeing here, and not considering how their brain actually works? Because when we misread the behavior, we risk fixing the wrong problems, and we might again, like, treat a difference in communication or processing as a deficit when it's actually a sign of a different operating system. And when we decode these misreads, we can shift from judgment to understanding, and then that shift can change everything. All right, so this is where the business case really comes into focus. When we're not just talking about like values or fairness, all those things certainly come into play, but we're really talking about measurable impact on innovation, on productivity, and on performance. For example, and you see I've got some statistics here, but just to call out a couple of them, research from HR Future shows that teams with neurodivergent professionals are 30% more productive and have 90% retention rates. That's incredible. McKinsey also found that neurodivergent teams solve problems faster and make better decisions. They're 30% quicker to solutions with higher confidence in the outcomes. Also incredible. And if you look at the other quotes on this slide from Pern, Candola, Gartner, and others, and there's lots of research out there if you're interested, but you'll see the same theme repeated. Organizations that invest in neurodivergent talent, they see benefits across the board. So if you're wondering, whether this work is worth the effort, the data says yes. So, my view is neuroinclusion isn't just a nice to have; it's actually a performance driver. So shifting from the research, I wanted to bring some real world examples to all of you, so we can look at some real world outcomes. So what happens when companies actually invest in neurodivergent talent in a thoughtful and in an intentional way? You'll see on the side, and I'll walk us through it a bit. I certainly have some large organizations with probably big budgets and all that good stuff, but this isn't limited to that by any means. It can be small companies, startups, boutique firms. They're seeing results as well. So I wanted to give you a kind of a spectrum of examples. So SAP. they're a global enterprise. I'm sure you've heard of them. They've launched their Autism at Work program, and they did that several years ago, and they saw operational improvements almost immediately. Their invoice processing time, these are just a few examples, dropped from days to 20 minutes. One neurodivergent employee alone uncovered $40 million in savings. I mean, there's lots of examples if you want to go and look up SAP. I just pulled out a couple. And their retention rate for neurodivergent hires now exceeds 90%. EY, another well-known company, they've built actual neurodiverse centers of excellence groups all over the world, and they're staffed by by neurodivergent consultants. And their results, more than 650 million in ROI since they launched in 2016. 2.6 million hours freed through automation, and 92% retention, far above industry averages. And so what you're seeing there too, a lot of loyalty with neurodivergent employees. They find their place. They, often, right, overgeneralization, but you're seeing some retention rates there. And then Enabled Intelligence, the US startup. They hired neurodivergent talent specifically to lead data accuracy services, and their teams hit 97% accuracy. They've built scalability targets, or they've beat scalability targets, and they've secured expanded federal contracts as a result. And then last but not least, CubeLinks, which is a UK finance firm, a boutique finance firm. They brought in autistic analysts to model. They have complex infrastructure deals, and their outcome was zero modeling errors, faster timelines, and higher client retention. So, all of this to say, big or small, these companies didn't just check a box. They built environments that allowed different thinkers to thrive. And when they did, the business benefits, they followed. All right. So barriers. I mentioned we'll talk about barriers. So we just looked at that business case, but wanting to bring neurodivergent employees intentionally, or to support your own neurodivergent employees intentionally, it's not enough to just attract neurodivergent talent. We also need to make sure the systems aren't pushing them out once they get there. And again, not an all-inclusive list, but here I just thought I'd highlight four common barriers that I've seen and know show up kind of again and again. The first one is unclear communication. That includes unspoken rules, vague expectations, priorities that shift without context. For those of us that process information, perhaps literally, or we need more time to transition, that kind of ambiguity can cause constant anxiety or missed cues, right? Masking and exhaustion, that's a barrier. I've mentioned it a couple of times, but many neurodivergent employees spend a huge amount of energy trying to appear typical. So that might mean scripting like their social interactions, hiding stimming behaviors. That's things like tapping, rocking, fidgeting to help regulate. I myself I don't know if you guys can see that there, maybe. I've got a stress ball in my hand at the moment. This helps me actually less about stress. What it helps me to do is helps me to stay focused and present with what I'm doing, because I mentioned I have a brain that's always going and always on. So, if that's not normalized in your environment, your neurodivergent employees carrying around a stress ball might be misconstrued as something else that it's not. Or just pushing through overall sensory overload, a loud office, things very, bright lights, things like that. Over time, that leads to burnout, disengagement, or even leaving the workforce altogether, which goes back to that 30, to 40% of the workforce, that the earlier data about them being unemployed or underemployed. And, it's hard to ask for help. Even when accommodations exist, the reality is there's stigma or even perhaps confusion about the process. Like for your neurodivergent employees, like they might keep them silent. Some aren't sure what to ask for. Um, if you're newly diagnosed, you might be just getting your head around that. You might not even be sure what to ask for, not even where to go, but even where to start. I think about too, and some of the trends I'm seeing in my own business and with clients that are coming my way is we've got a lot of new graduates or individuals earlier in their career where maybe these supports existed. Supports were available to them in school, in college, what have you. But then they get into the workforce, and those same supports are no longer available, or they don't even know how to navigate the corporate system to ask for what they need. And then the other piece, and this is something to really emphasize, is some don't ask out of fear. They fear they won't be taken seriously. They fear that they're going to be viewed as incapable because of a lot of the stigma that's out there, and not known. And then lastly, not being believed. Even when someone does share, they may be met with like that skepticism or downplaying, comments like, well, you don't seem autistic, or even an unintentional comment like, we all have a little OCD. That sort of thing can be invalidating, even if people don't mean for it to be. And that's why this quote, I think, hits so hard, is that too often neurodivergent professionals are forced to fit into systems that were never built within them in mind. So when we address these barriers, we're not just doing the right thing, which of course that's true, but we're also unlocking talent that we might have been overlooking. All right. So this is my favorite slide. Um, and I want to zoom out for just a minute. So neuroinclusion isn't just about what happens when someone's on the team, right? It's about what happens across the entire employee journey, kind of from start to finish, from the moment someone sees your job, your job posting, and how they're supported and developed over time, as well. And that's why I wanted to break things down by stage, from attraction to hire, onboarding, supporting, and growing. And I'm truly just giving you all a taster here. I could do a deep dive session on each of these stages and options. And clearly I'm very passionate about it. But for today, I just wanted to give you all some food for thought. So each of these areas present small actionable shifts that don't require big budgets but could make a big difference, and who thrives. And there's a really, if there's any hesitation around cost, that stat at the top says it all, and you can find various versions of this statistic out there. But 56% of workplace adjustments for neurodivergent employees cost nothing, and another 37% costs less than $500. And hopefully, as we walk through this a bit, this will start to come clear for you. So when the question might come up, can we afford to make these changes? I think the argument comes forward is really what might you gain if you do? Because as we've already talked about, there's a lot of benefits there. So let's walk through a few examples. We're started with attraction. So posting language, job posting language matters, right? If you're using vague buzzwords or jargon, some neurodivergent candidates may not apply. So not because they're unqualified, but because they don't they don't see themselves in the words. So if you think of phrases like strong verbal presence or excellent people skills, natural communicator, these all sound straightforward, but they're actually quite subjective, and someone might wonder, a neurodivergent individual might wonder, does that mean I have to enjoy small talk? Is this some kind of code for being extroverted? Those are the sorts of things. So for candidates who prefer clarity, who might be very literal in their thinking, it helps to explain the actual task. So for communication, we'll just take that one for example, saying things like present project updates in cross-functional teams. That's a lot clearer, right? Or respond to client questions by email and phone. Thinking about your job postings through those types of lenses, and also stating flexibility up front, like flexible schedules, ability to adjust your working hours, things like that can make a difference. Or even featuring, neuroinclusion on your careers page. That can make the difference between actually someone taking the step to apply, or opting out because they don't see themselves as someone that's going to fit into your culture, which may not be the case at all. And then we get to hiring. And standard, as we all know, lots of HR people here, standard interview processes often reward those who perform well under pressure, speak confidently, especially kind of put on the spot, or mere expected communication styles. Like a big one that here is eye contact, right? That's an expected communication style, but that doesn't always correlate with job performance. As we likely know, I think we all can think of a story when we thought that employee just shined so much in the interview and got into the workplace, and that didn't come to fruition. But things like offering, some of these are maybe a little controversial, but many companies are doing it, but offering interview questions ahead of time, or giving alternative formats like writing or case-based exercises, or a balance of the verbal kind of traditional interview and balancing it with something like that. That can better reflect someone's strengths. And also, you do want to train your interviewers on neuro-inclusive awareness, because otherwise those biases do creep in. So I'll just go back to eye contact. I mean, lack of it could be misconstrued, or could surface a hiring manager bias, and that they may view the candidate as untrustworthy or untruthful, when actually the candidate may just struggle with eye contact. So just something to think about from a training perspective. And then onboarding, and this is where early disengagement can happen if you're not thoughtful. So even something as simple as assigning a buddy who understands neuroinclusion, and also like giving, when you think about your orientation, and those kind of first things the employee needs to know, giving onboarding content, in a staggered way, staggering it out, or breaking information up over time so they don't get it all at once in one day and it's overwhelming, or sending pre-reads or follow-ups, or pacing onboarding in phases. And then that extends beyond the first day of orientation, because think about the employees getting trained, or they're learning about their role from their manager or peer, what have you, but managing that information thoughtfully, and supporting how they process or retain the information. Some of the same rules apply that I just mentioned for orientation day, like staggering the content, or what have you. And then another one that I think is really, can be really tough, for a neurodivergent employee, is really being, we talk about office politics, or those unspoken kinds of rules of your culture. How do you clearly state those, or surface those workplace norms and spell out those expectations so that folks know what they are right away? And it could be little things like how are meetings run? How do you prep for your one-on-ones? What's typical email response time? Is it 24 hours? Is it 20 minutes? I mean, things like that. Those can really help reduce friction and avoid confusion. And then we get to support. So, one size doesn't fit all. Um, Asking how someone prefers to communicate and how they like to receive information. Is it by email, Slack, in person, video, chat, what have you? Share examples of typical adjustments to kind of normalize that there's flexibility within your culture, such as, hey, if you've been on Zoom calls all day and you need to turn your camera off occasionally or have a off camera meeting when you need it, that's okay. Just, we allow that. Provide team agendas in advance. Neurodivergent employees often do better when they know what to expect or, don't like surprises. That can be very dysregulating. Allowing time blocked calendars for deep focus time, normalizing, wearing headphones in the office or do not disturb for people who need headphones, perhaps to stay focused or to manage, sensory issues. And putting instructions in writing where possible, like following up. An employee just has gotten a new project, they've met with their manager, they've gotten the download, but maybe following that manager follows that up with just confirming, here's the problem we're trying to solve, what success looks like, here's some other written things, the timeline, etc. That can really be helpful. And then last but not least, growing. Too often professional growth is tied into being outspoken or charismatic, or that isn't always the best for all thinkers. So, focus on strengths-based coaching, shift focus from who speaks up most in a meeting, perhaps, to who drives the most results, and champion that and offer written feedback, perhaps before discussions. This helps those who can, again, feel dysregulated, like I spoke to about those surprises, to really be able to process that up front and have some time to prep for that conversation. So in short, it's not a one-time initiative. It's a lens that can guide the entire experience. All right. So the great thing to point out, and I think if this is something I hope everyone really takes away, is that when you design for neurodivergent needs, if you think about all the things we just covered on that list, and if you're, think to yourself, I mean, those things can actually benefit everyone. And that's where neurodiversity comes in rather than neurodivergence. So if you hear the term diversity, that's really thinking about the full range of how human brains work in general, whether they're neurodivergent or neurotypical, and designing your system so that it sets everyone up for success. So if you look to the list on the left, again, like things we've talked about, like clear meeting agendas, written instructions, flexible response times for email and chat. These aren't elaborate accommodations, but they're small shifts that can really remove friction for everyone. Or options for how to communicate, shorter, more focused meetings. I mean, most people probably don't, love week after week having full day meetings or things like that. Um, Less sensory overload, from lighting or noise, and thinking about your workplace and where you can be, mindful of that. There are all kinds of barriers, there are all kinds of changes, I should say, that reduce these barriers for neurodivergent team members. And they also make things and make work easier and smoother and more predictable for everyone else. And that's what you see on the other side of the slide. There's more clarity, there's better preparation, less burnout, higher productivity. And I would say, who doesn't want that? So again, just to reinforce, thinking through these lenses isn't necessarily about adding more process. It's really about making your system smarter, and I would argue maybe more human. When we reduce pressure and when we give people more clarity and choice, we typically get stronger outcomes across the board. So the key takeaway with this is really designing for neurodivergence strengthens the whole system. And most of these changes, again, cost little or nothing to implement. All right, just about 30 seconds here to kind of bring this into the real world. If you guys want to type in the chat, I'd love to know from the things that we've talked about, what's maybe one thing you could implement immediately to support your neurodivergent employees? Is there anything that resonates with you? I see clearer meeting objectives and agendas. Anyone else want to chat some? Normalizing a stress ball or fidget item. Yep, it's a great one. Anyone else? Lots of things. Yeah, clearer expectations. All great stuff. Thank you for that. Yep, awesome. All right. So what can you do next? You don't have to overhaul everything all at once. And I actually would say there's also opportunities to ask your employees what might make the biggest difference in your culture, maybe to pilot some things or whatever. I'm always a fan of pilots, but just to note again, you don't have to do everything at once. You can start small. You can stay curious. You can find out again what's really having the impact that you're hoping it will have. You can start where you are. You can audit your hiring, your onboarding, your feedback systems as an example. I think the real key is looking for friction points that might unintentionally exclude or confuse neurodivergent candidates, employees, etc. And then your leaders play a really key role here, teaching them how to flex, their communication and leadership styles. And one of the simplest things that I think we can do that actually benefits everyone, but really something your leaders can do is just in general asking your employees, how do you work best? It's such a simple question. How do you work best? Do you work best in the morning? Do you, or do you do your very best work at like 5 p.m.? I mean, do you need a quiet environment? Except there's a million different things. Do you want me to give you feedback in writing, or do you prefer verbal feedback? Et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things that can be asked, but normalizing that and asking it, often or occasionally, because things could change, but just doing that can really make a big difference. And then obviously partnering with a specialist, and this is the work I do. So I coach neurodivergent employees. I support HR teams. I help leaders design systems that work for everyone. So you can work with a specialist like me or someone like me that can really fast track some of the things that you'd like to do. And as we're rounding out the end here, how do you partner? How do you partner with me? So first of all, I'd love to connect with you if you're interested, or even if you have questions or want to further the discussion. Part of my passion is even just educating and advocacy around this. So I'm happy to do that. And you can book a free discovery call with me. There's a QR code there, and you guys will get the slide and other information following the session. And if other ideas that might have been sparked, and you want to explore what that would look like in your workplace, I'd love to talk. For coaching, I want to comment too. I not only coach neurodivergent professionals, but I also coach parents. And I personally have 3 neurodivergent children, so sometimes people want to talk with me about how to best manage from a parent perspective, whether the parent is themselves neurodivergent or not. There's a lot of things we can do there on the home front. I also am an emotional intelligence EQI 2.0 certified administrator, so I can do that test, which can be a great assessment tool for surfacing your neurodivergent employee strengths and areas that might be harder for them, such as emotional expression or assertiveness. If you've got a high performer or talent on your team that you'd really, want to do some individualized, work with, that's something I can do in isolation or in combination with some coaching. And then I offer, consulting support, like I mentioned, for HR or leadership teams. And that can include training, workshops, process reviews. Another thing that's gaining traction, I'll just mention briefly, we've got a couple of seconds, is that employee resource group development. Many companies, small and large, are designing employee resource groups for neurodivergent employees specifically, or building a neurodivergent, framework into existing employee resource groups. And that can also be a popular resource, not just for your neurodivergent employees themselves, but I'm seeing a lot of kind of overflow advantages and data around what if, back to my point of parents, what if they have neurodivergent children at home? They're learning a lot in these ERG groups from other neurodivergent employees. What did you struggle with in school, or what helped set you up for college if you've got neurodivergent children going off to school, things like that. And just sharing from their experiences can really be empowering for your neurodivergent employees, but also have an overflow positive impact for your non-neurodivergent team members. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Kim, but I want to thank all of you for spending this hour with me. It's been a pleasure talking to you on this topic, which I could speak about for half a day or longer, probably. Kim?
Well, that might be the next session that we do, is diving into one of these sections. I really thank you so much, Cassandra, and everybody on the call for taking the time and choosing to spend it with us. We really, really appreciate it. I hope everyone is able to get outside and enjoy this wonderful weather and have a great rest of your summer. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.